what we plan to do is collect all the speakers' notes, even the ones that you probably already have, and get them uploaded on the website where all these videos have been uploaded to, so that you can download the PDF copies of them. So that's the plan. In the meantime, you have to bear with us, I'm afraid. We're looking at Ezra chapter 7, verse 9. So let's turn there in our Bibles. As we're turning there, I've done a short introduction on the Millerite timeline, and before I go into Ezra 7, I normally spend a bit more time explaining how you go from the Millerite timeline into our own, because it's not as straightforward as you might imagine. But because of shortness of time, I'm not going to be able to do that. But there are presentations online that not only I but other people have done that explain that in some depth, of how you transfer from the Millerite timeline to our own. The reason why it's not that straightforward is because there's not only a work of repeating the three angels' messages, there's also a work of combining them together. And that combination of the first and second angel's messages is not as straightforward as you might imagine it to be. Having said that, let's read Ezra chapter 7, verse 9. We'll pick up from verse 8. And he, Ezra, came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king. And if you go back to verse 1, you'll see this is King Artaxerxes. For upon the first day of the 1st month began he to go up from Babylon. And on the first day of the 5th month came he to Jerusalem, according to the good hand of his God upon him. So you can see here that there are two dates that are mentioned: the first day of the 1st month and the first day of the 5th month. And as we go through this study, we'll see that we can use these two key dates as two starting points. So let me just explain where we're headed before we go into the proof of all of this. Many of us probably already understand this, but we may not understand the proof behind it. We understand that Ezra leaves on the first day of the 1st month, and he leaves Babylon. So you can see, in some shape or form, there's a call out of Babylon that's occurring on the first day of the 1st month. He arrives in Jerusalem on the first day of the 5th month. Now, when Samuel Snow began to understand these truths, and he began to explain the relevance of Ezra chapter 7, he used a number of proofs, as I've already mentioned. There are 4 proofs, and this is the key component to his explanation of what the disappointment was in the spring of 1844 and how he began to resolve it. And what he did was, he took the first day of the 1st month, where they left Babylon, and he realized that after they entered into Jerusalem on the first day of the 5th month, that it would take some time for them to organize themselves so that they could keep the feast on the 10th day of the 7th month. And the reason he selected that day is because of the work of William Miller. So we understand that William Miller was dealing with Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. This was the key passage that was unsealed in the Millerite history. And Ellen White tells us that what was unsealed about the book of Daniel was the unsealing of time. There were many people before William Miller who had some kind of understanding of Daniel chapter 8, many portions of Daniel, whether they were correct or not. But what William Miller brought to God's people was an understanding that Daniel chapter 8 was a fulfillment of a very specific time prophecy, the 2300 days. And we understand that God, through his angel, gave William Miller the commencement date. William Miller was given 3 commencement dates. If you're not aware of it, he was given the commencement date of 677, 457, and 508. And it's this date here that allowed him to develop all the information that's on this chart, and specifically the year 1843. You've got the year 457 up there, you've got the year 677, and you've got the year 508. These are the 3 commencement dates for 3 prophecies that were given to William Miller. Ellen White confirms this, and his understanding of this commencement date in relation with prophetic time, which we all understand that one day equals 1 year, allowed him to come to the year 1843 in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. Now, William Miller initially understood that Christ would come the second time during the autumn. So he had an understanding of that already before the autumn of 1843. So let me just explain a little bit of background on this. This is the year 1843, and this is 1844. But we're going to go from spring to spring. So this is Miller's reckoning of time, and the way we understand time is that we would begin 1843 this way in 1844. So this is us today, because we would go from the winter to the winter. This would be 43 and this would be 44. So this is pure Gregorian time. This is the calendar that all of us understand. And what William Miller is doing, he's superimposing 2 calendars, one on top of the other, to come to this understanding. So if we put the autumn of 1843 here, this would be the autumn. William Miller already understood and had an idea that Christ would come, or the autumn feast would be a fulfillment of his second advent. But as time passed through 1844, because William Miller was very clear in his presentations that Christ would come sometime in 1843. He wouldn't be very definite when he would present his message. But after the autumn of 1843, people began to shift their attention and look to the spring as the final fulfillment of Christ's return, which was the cleansing of the sanctuary from Daniel 8:14. So they were forced to shift from an autumn reckoning to a spring reckoning, not because of any understanding of Scripture, but just because time had slipped, because their timing had come to an end, and they were still in the year 1843, so they were still clear on this, based upon the 2300-day prophecy. But they began to move away from this understanding of an autumn fulfillment, But Samuel Snow kept hold of that truth and began to develop it. Now, initially, very few people accepted what he was teaching, and he began to get an understanding of this, particularly around the beginning of 1844, in the month of February. I think in the notes that Brother Jeff left you, there's a timeline that he's given which shows the presentations or the information that Samuel Snow brought to God's people, and it shows the development of that truth. But by February, he's fairly convinced now that this is going to be an incorrect fulfillment. So he's going back to the work of William Miller, and he is sure that it's the autumn that Christ is going to return in, that William Miller was initially correct, but it's not the year 1843, but it's going to be in the year 1844. So it would be here. And he's not just doing that because he says, oh, we'll just move over a year. He's using an understanding of Bible, how history has repeated and the fulfillment of prophecies, and he develops a very sophisticated argument to show and demonstrate that Christ is not going to return in the spring of this year, but he's actually going to return in the autumn of the following year. So we've already explained how his reasoning goes. After February, in April, he writes a letter which gets published in the April, and then we've identified that in July 21st, 1844, that he has a significant presentation at the Boston Tabernacle, and here people begin to fully understand the point that he's making, and it begins to get accepted. But it's only a single meeting, and there are a limited number of people who understand it. And then by the time you get to the 15th of August, there's a large camp meeting in Exeter, and his message finally gets accepted by the vast majority of the Millerites, and this is why we identify this as the Midnight Cry. The Millerites identified it themselves as the Midnight Cry, and they identified this date here as midnight. So all of this we've already discussed a number of times this week, that this is the midnight and this is the Midnight Cry. And as we've brought these truths into our own history and they become present truth, this is now being defined as the binding off period that's been discussed. So this is a bit of background of how this shift happens. So Samuel Snow is going to use this date to calculate when this date is going to happen. And so this date they determine to be the 19th of April. And from this date here, they can calculate what this date is going to be, which is the 22nd of October. And that's what we're going to explain by God's grace. I'll leave that for a moment in case you're still writing it down. So what does Ezra 7 teach us? It teaches us a number of things. It teaches us the first day of the first month. It teaches us the first day of the fifth month. The Millerites didn't make great play of this event here. I explained this in my previous presentation, but an understanding of this and how it was fulfilled in Millerite history has now brought Ezra 7 to be present truth for God's people today. So you can see straight away that there are two pieces of information that Ezra 7 brings to us. The first of the first month and the first of the fifth month. Because of shortness of time, and most people here are reasonably familiar with this, if this was the Millerite timeline, and this was 1840, and this was April 1844, October 1844, so we're all fairly familiar with this, This is the midnight cry, August the 15th, and this is May 1842, where the 1843 chart was brought into history. So this is a very simple view of Millerite history. We understand that the first angel's message was empowered here, and the second angel's message arrived here. When we bring this history into our own, without spending a lot of time explaining it, as I say, this material is available on the internet, and I don't have time to go into it in detail, but there's a work of combining. So this angel, the first angel's message, comes down into our own history here. But we can also demonstrate that this second angel doesn't just drop down straight, it gets combined with the first angel. So we find in our own history that the first angel's message and the second angel's message need to be combined together. And we understand this is the third angel's message. And we can demonstrate that this third angel's message, which is a shut door, also comes into our history here as a shut door. And this is the Sunday law. And this is the close of probation for the Millerites. And this is the close of probation for Adventists. If you're not familiar with this and you don't understand it clearly enough, this is a vital piece of information that you need to understand. The reason for that is, we've already explained that this is the first day of the first month. I've not shown you how we demonstrate that, but this is the first day of the first month. So if we write the first of the first here, and we're going to get this history and bring it into our own history here, we can see that 9/11 is also the first day of the first month. And if the midnight cry is the first day of the fifth month, which it is in this history here, because this is the 15th of August at the Exeter camp meeting, the Millerites identified this as the midnight cry, but they didn't identify it as the first day of the fifth month. But when we bring this history into our own, we will see that we too are expecting a midnight cry, and it will occur on the first day of the fifth month. But obviously we need to always reiterate the point that we're not dealing with time in our history, in our generation, in our history, in our reform line. So when we say that it will be filled on the first day of the fifth month, or the first day of the first month, what we're not going to be doing is going back into calendars and trying to calculate what day this was or what day this was in a particular year, as the Millerites were required to do. What we will be doing is that we will take these dates and use them symbolically in our time. So we have to understand, and we keep reiterating this point, that we're not using this information and these numbers and these dates as literal dates that we need to establish and find out that in the year 2001, what was the first day of the first month, and we could say it might be April the 16th or something, and do some kind of calculation. We're not doing that. These are symbols that we need to understand. So when we can get an understanding of this truth here, that 9/11 is the first day of the first month, and that the midnight cry is the first day of the fifth month, and we understand that October the 22nd was the 10th day of the seventh month, and symbolically this also would be the 10th day of the seventh month. What it gives us the ability to do is to get these dates and to use them as symbols. So we need to be really clear that these are now symbols. Just in the same way that we've used symbols, and you've seen that brought to view over and over again this week. For instance, you've seen the 1260 used as a symbol. Yeah? So when we understood, or it was shown to you, that the 1260 is a symbol, then you know that the 1260, according to Revelation 12, is also identified as a wilderness. So that's relatively straightforward to understand. You can go from a 1260 to a wilderness, and then what you can do is you can use the term wilderness as another symbol, and from that symbol develop new truth. Because not only is the 1260 a wilderness, according to Revelation 12, but we also know that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness not for 1260 years, but for 40 years. So you can see that what we're doing is we're taking numbers or words and using them as symbols. And the reason why we keep on doing that is because when we see a number 40, and if a 40 represents a time period like this, from the Red Sea to the entering of Canaan at Jericho, and this was the number 40, what we can do is we see that this 40 allows us to get this history, and because 40 is a symbol of our own history, we can get this history and bring it into our own, like so. So that's why we can say that the word wilderness, or the number 40, or a 1260 can be taken and brought into our own history. And so we're going to use these also as symbols. So if we were to go in the Bible and look at the first day of the first month in an obscure passage, which at first sight doesn't have any relevancy to our own history, what we can do is we can take that history, that story, which deals with the first of the first month, and we can see it's typifying something that's occurring at 9/11. So we can get that truth and an understanding, a prophetic understanding of that story, and bring it into our own history here. And we can do the same with the first day of the fifth month, and do the same here. So you can see the reasoning behind using these dates as symbols and the purpose for doing that. But Ezra 7 gives us some further information besides these two dates. So we have one key and another, which would help to explain the events surrounding 9/11 and the events surrounding the Midnight Cry. Because if we go from the first of the fifth month to the 10th day of the seventh month, we can establish the time that it takes to get from here to here. And I'll show you that it actually calculates at 70 days. But we're not going to use that 70 days in some kind of literal fashion to say that there are going to be 70 days between the midnight cry and the Sunday law. How are we going to use this 70? We're going to use it symbolically. So then we're going to go in the scriptures and see where there are stories that refer to the number 70, and get those stories and put them into this history. So you see that this has already been done in the story of Joseph and his family, Jacob. You saw that when Joseph called his family back into Egypt, that it says there were 70 people, so it said there were 70 people of the family of Jacob. And so because it was the number 70 here, we could see that this story can be placed into our history here, because here we have a number 70. And you can do this in a number of different ways, a number of times. So do you understand the methodology between when we take Ezra 7, how we can use these dates and use them as symbols, and the time between the 1st of the 5th month and the 10th of the 7th, which is also a number, and use all of these as symbols. If you go back to the history of the Millerites right here, we know that Samuel Snow actually arrived on the 14th of August, 1844, which was the 30th day of the 4th month. So we have two key dates here, and if we went from the 30th day of the 4th month and we calculated the time between these two events, we'd get the number 120. And so now you can use the number 120 as a symbol, and every time you see this symbol, it can be brought into this history here between the 1st of the 1st month and the 1st of the 5th month, and we'd get 120. So this is the great light that's come from Ezra chapter 7. These four symbols, 1, 2, 3, 4, have given us an explosion of information that we didn't have even a very short time ago. It's only within the last perhaps 18 months that these truths have been brought to us. That Ezra 7 gives you these four pieces of information which have opened up the scriptures in a very profound and important way. Which is all good enough, which is all good, but another piece of information that isn't directly established from Ezra chapter 7 is this date here, July 21st. (1844), and I've already mentioned that this is the 5th day of the 4th month, and this is found in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1. And the reason why this is so important is because when you see how Ezra 7 was fulfilled in this year of 1844, using a combination of a number of different calendars, a biblical calendar, a Hebrew calendar, and our own Gregorian calendar. And as you overlay those calendars correctly, it has to be done correctly, all these truths begin to shine out. And the reason why this is so important is because from Ezra chapter 7, which just gives you these two key dates, you can get two further pieces of information. And when this is confirmed, that we understand that the first day of the 5th month here, in this specific year of 1844, was fulfilled on the very day of the 15th of August at the Exeter Camp meeting. We've also found that on the 21st of July, at the Boston Tabernacle, when Samuel Snow began to explain his message to a wider audience, and it began to be accepted, and the Millerites understood this to be the midnight, this has opened this whole new truth about the binding off period between the 21st of July and the 15th of August. As I said, the Millerites had an understanding of these two dates, and they called this the midnight, and this was the midnight cry. But of course they had no understanding of this binding off period. And it's... Sorry? I think someone's already asked this question in the Q&A session. When the Millerites spoke about the true midnight cry, they were not so much talking about a specific event, but they were saying this whole truth here from here to here, this message of the midnight cry, which they derived from the parable of the 10 virgins, was the true midnight cry. Prior to this, they understood that the midnight cry was going to happen here sometime in 1843 because they saw that Christ would return at midnight. But when they got to April 1844 and they had a clearer understanding of the parable of the 10 virgins, it's in this history that they call this history the true midnight cry. So we're not trying to identify the true midnight cry, that term, as a single date, but they understood that this was the midnight from the parable, and here the cry was made to the whole of the Millerite movement, and it began to move with great power at this stage here. So I'm not trying to suggest that they had the clarity of the midnight and the midnight cry in the same way we do, because they didn't understand it in the same way we do. But this truth has allowed us to understand many, many things, but specifically that at the midnight there's going to be this binding off period, and there's this whole complication about it being a period and a point in time, because essentially these are the same message. So it's something that we're still trying to wrap our minds around. So this is an overview of why these dates are important and what Ezra 7 brings to us. So what we want to do now is spend some time trying to understand the different calendars that we need to deal with. I want to read to you from an Adventist historian stroke scholar. Her name is Grace Amadon. And she was alive around the 40s and 50s. And she did a lot of research on different calendations to demonstrate the truthfulness of October 22nd, 1844. She did a lot of research on her on that date of 1844 and how the Millerites developed their understanding. If you want to, research her materials and find out more of what she says, I do want to warn you that there are various ministries who use her writings to prove their version of facts. And there's one specific site that deals with the lunar Sabbaths. So I don't want to be a promoter of error and introduce you to anything wrong, but there are many people who have strange ideas, and they use either spirit of prophecy or they use sound scholarly work to prove and demonstrate that their ideas are correct, which they're not. So if you start researching her, you might find her material on websites that I wouldn't recommend you start studying or look at her material, but it's not that widely available. But the few people who promote her material promote it for their own means. So please be warned about that if you see her on a website, don't think that because she's a sound scholar and she gives very good information, that the material on that website is in any way good or that we would be promoting it. Does that make sense? So, having said that, let me read what she says. This is taken from Ancient Jewish Calendation, page 9. Ancient Jewish Calendation, page 9. In ancient times, the law commanded Israel that a handful of the first fruits of the land to which they should come should be presented to the priest for an offering at Passover time before any bread, parched corn, or green ears should be eaten by the people. This was to be a statute forever throughout the generations in all their dwellings. And that's taken from Leviticus 23, verses 10 to 14. And that was read to you yesterday in Brother Lawrence's presentation. By this law, the ancient Hebrew year was regulated, and the full moon of barley harvest marked the first month of the year, which was called Abib, sometimes called Aviv, signifying new fruits or green ears. Deuteronomy 16, verse 1. Consequently, the sickle became the sign of the first month and the paschal season. The law of the first fruits could not operate in the cold winds and snow of Palestinian March, and therefore it is conclusive that the original Jewish Passover feast did not occur so early as March. Around Jerusalem, the earliest ripe barley occurs in April, near the end of the first week, and the harvest itself lasts until about the 1st of June. So all she's basically saying is this, that the first day of the first month is controlled by certain criteria. And one of them that she mentions is the new moon. And the second one that she mentions is the barley harvest. So these two key points are something that we're going to spend some time discussing, that we need to understand how the Hebrews calculated their year. And she's already told us that it's related to the new moon and also to the barley harvest. So we've already read previously, it was only yesterday, so I won't take us again to Leviticus 23, but we understand that the Passover was on the 14th day of the first month. Then on the 15th day, there's a Sabbath rest. And this was a ceremonial Sabbath, remember? And then on the 16th day is the first fruits. And we understand that Christ died on this Friday, he rested on the Sabbath, and he resurrected as the first fruits on the 16th, and this was the Sunday. And when Christ resurrected, we know that he not only resurrected by himself, but there were another second group that resurrected with him. And this is a common theme that we need to understand, that the first fruits comes in two parts. Again, this has been discussed a few times, because when you go to there's a first fruit offering also at Pentecost. So we see one here on the 16th in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then we see another one at Pentecost. And again at Pentecost, we're going to see two loaves of wheat. They're going to be presented, and this concept or idea of two is an important thing for us to understand, because we've spoken a number of times now about the priests and the Levites, these two first fruits that are going to form the final first fruits, or those people that come from Adventism. You can see here that these first fruits here and these first fruits here have to be controlled by the seasons that are occurring in Jerusalem. And she's alluded to this when she says, the law of the first fruits could not operate in the cold winds and snow of Palestinian March. So we understand that if we want to have a harvest, you cannot harvest too early in the year. So to get a barley harvest, and the barley harvest has to be controlled by this date here. This is a fixed date in the year where you're going to get the first fruits, and then you're going to have the full harvest. And we understand 50 days later that at Pentecost, you're then going to have the wheat harvest. So this was the barley harvest, and this is the wheat harvest. The two separate harvests, one for barley, one for wheat. And if you have these events occurring too early in the year, you won't actually have any grain ready. So you have to make sure that you begin your year, begins here, on the first of the first month. It has to begin in a certain time of the year that this harvest can be ready and this harvest can be ready. Just want to read from, it's an excerpt taken from Wikipedia called the Hebrew calendar. Hebrew calendar, it's taken from Wikipedia. The Hebrew calendar is a lunar solar calendar. So we want to just begin that point. This is an important point that we need to really get to grips with, that the Hebrew calendar is a lunar solar calendar. And we understand what that term means. That's to do with the moon, and that's to do with the sun. So just to clarify right now, our calendar, the calendar that you and I live by, is not a lunar solar calendar. We live exclusively by a solar calendar. We take no consideration of the moon cycle. And our calendar was developed and designed by Rome, and then developed and refined by the papacy. So we have a totally secular and paganistic calendar. That's what we live with. But the Hebrews followed the model and the counsel that God gave, and so they had to follow a lunar solar calendar. The Hebrew calendar is a lunar solar calendar, meaning that months are based on lunar months, but years are based on solar years. The calendar year features 12 lunar months of 29 or 30 days. So they have a lunar solar year, and their months are controlled by the moon. So they're going to have their months controlled by the moon, and we don't. You know that our months are not controlled by the cycle of the moon, they're just arbitrary dates. 28, 31, 30, in no particular pattern or system. The calendar features 12 lunar months of 29, 30 days. So I just want to address this issue. They have 29 to 30 day months. And the reason they have that is because if this is a picture of the Earth, and here's the moon, and it's traveling around the Earth, it takes approximately 29 and a half days for the moon to go round the Earth in one cycle. And obviously, if you're going to work out your year, you can't have a month that's got half days. They have to be full days. So what the Hebrews did is that 1 month would be 30 days. So they'd add half a day and make it 30. And then the next month would be 29. And then the next would be 30. And the next would be 29. So they'd have 6 months of 30 days and 6 months of 29 days. So on average, there would be 29 and a half days. So that's the way that they would run their months. The calendar year features 12 lunar months of 29 to 30 days with an intercalary lunar month added periodically to synchronize the 12 lunar cycles with the longer solar year. So I'm going to explain that in a bit more depth. But an intercalary means they add an extra month in. So we call it a leap year. Everybody knows that every 4 years we have a leap year. So that's intercalary is just another way of saying leap. So I'll just say it this way. The calendar features 12 lunar months of 29 or 30 days with a leap month added periodically to synchronize the 12 lunar cycles with the longer solar year. These extra months are added 7 times every 19 years. So there's some complexity about how they do that, and I'll explain in a moment in a really simple way so you can understand what that's talking about. The mean period of lunar months, precisely the synodic month, is very close to 29 and a half days, shown you here. Accordingly, the basic Hebrew calendar year is one of 12 lunar months alternating between 29 and 30 days. The insertion of a leap month is based upon the requirement that Passover, the festival celebrating the Exodus from Egypt, which took place in the spring, we've already understood that, always occurs in the northern hemisphere in the spring season. Since the adoption of a fixed calendar, intercalculations or leap months in the Hebrew calendar have been assigned to fixed points. Prior to this, the intercalculation or leap month was determined empirically. So empirically is a complicated way of saying that you need to do an experiment or an observation to see when you do that. Then it finally finishes, it says the year may be intercalculated on 3 grounds: Aviv, which is Abib, which is the barley harvest or the first fruits, and the spring equinox and the new moon. So let's try and explain some of this complexity. There are various types of calendars that we need to understand. There's a biblical calendar, there's a prophetic calendar, and we'll deal with these two first. So, in a biblical calendar, there are 12 months in 1 year. And there are 30 days in a month. And there are 360 days in a year. So you can demonstrate this in the Bible, particularly in the book of Genesis. And when we talk about a biblical calendar, we want to understand that this was a literal, real-life calendar in the time before the flood. This is how the earth and the moon circled around the sun, and this was real time. So it was real 12 months, there were real literal 30 days per month, and there were literally 360 days every year. And when we talk about prophetic time, we understand from the book of Numbers and Ezekiel that 1 day equals 1 year. And we use this extensively. Now, there are many people, if you go on the internet, who understand the day for a year, but they apply it incorrectly. Because what they do is they apply the day for a year and use our own calendar to do that application. But we're one of the few people who understand this correctly, and we get this clearly from the Millerites, that when we talk about prophetic time, we're going to be using a biblical calendar. So we see that in essence these are the same thing. So when we talk about a day for a year, if you talk about 1 year in prophetic time, it would be 360 days or 360 years. And that can be demonstrated and proved fairly easily. And then we have Hebrew reckoning. Now, I don't have any evidence, I don't have any scientific proof, I can't demonstrate to you in any way, but many Christian scientists understand or have come to the conclusion, you don't have to be a scientist to come to this conclusion, is that there was a change at the flood in the relationship between the earth, the moon and the sun. Some change happened, some dramatic change happened, because we know the whole climate changed. And if you, as far as you want to go back into any ancient civilization, and you can only go back about 4,000 years for obvious reasons, every ancient civilization have always come up with the same scenario, the same situation, that 1 year is about 365 days and 1 moon cycle is 29 and a half days. It's been fixed for millennia. So we have some evidence to suggest that at the flood there was some dramatic change that occurred, and there was a shift of the Earth's axis. We don't understand what happened. We're not given that information, but there was a significant change. And after the flood, all the civilizations that you want to go back to, the Egyptians, the Hebrews, the Babylonians, all of them have to make allowance that the months and the years do not align correctly. They no longer line up. How you fix your years, very complicated. The Hebrews were not the only people who used the lunar solar calendar. Most of the ancient civilizations did that, but we're going to understand how the Hebrews did it. The Hebrews had two calendars to begin with. First, they had a judicial or a civil calendar, and they had a religious calendar. And the only difference between the two calendars is when it would start. The civil calendar started in the autumn, and the religious calendar started in the spring. Obviously, we're dealing with religion, so we're going to pick up this calendar here. In this religious calendar, there are two ways of calculating time. There's one which we call the rabbinical, and there's a second which we call Karaite. And in both calendars, let me put it here. Rabbinical and Karaite. You have either 12 or 13 months in each one. If you remember, we just read this when we said an intercalary or a leap month has to be added periodically every few years. We've already read that there are 29 to 30 days per month. And so you can see that in 1 year, it's not a fixed amount of days. It ranges from 354 to 384. But even that isn't fixed, because the Hebrews had even some more complicated arrangements that they did during the middle part of the year, where they would adjust some of their months so that their festivals would arrive on particular dates or avoid certain dates. But this is a fairly good approximation for our purposes. And then we have our own calendar, which is the Gregorian calendar. Sorry, Mr. R here, Gregorian calendar. And in our calendar we have 12 months, and we go from 28 to 30 days a month, and we have 365 days a year. And we start our year in the winter, and the rabbinical reckoning, they start their year in the spring, as do the Karaites. The main difference between rabbinical reckoning and Karaite reckoning is that the rabbis only control their year with the sun and the moon. And I'll explain this as we go along. But the Karaites control the beginning of the year with the sun, moon, and the barley. Now, all of this might seem a bit of a moot point to you, but let's turn to Daniel chapter 7. And before we read Daniel chapter 7, I just want to read a small article from the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's about the Karaite calendar. It says this: the Karaites, a sect founded in the 8th century, refused, with some exceptions, to recognize the normative fixed calendar. So a normative fixed calendar is a normal fixed calendar. And what they're talking about is this calendar here, this rabbinical calendar. This calendar here is fixed by calculations. But this calendar here cannot be fixed by calculation. Remember I read a moment ago where it said they worked it out empirically. An empirical assessment is an experiment that you do. You have to do something practical. So the Karaites did something practical, and the rabbis just did things through calculation. So that's the point that's being made here. It says to recognize the normative or normal fixed calendar, because this was fixed by calculation, and reintroduced. So this is in the 8th century, and they're reintroducing something. They reintroduced observation of the new moon. Leap years were determined by observing the maturation of the barley crop in Palestine. So when they say new moon here, they mean the new moon that's connected with the barley, because the rabbis look for a new moon, but the new moon that they're looking for is not connected to the barley. And all this is happening around the 8th century. Consequently, Karaites often celebrated the festivals on dates different from those fixed by the rabbis. Later in medieval times, the Karaites adopted some of the normative calendar practices while rejecting others. So during the Middle Ages, after the 8th century, you can see that the Karaites begin to apostatize and go back and follow the ways of the rabbis. So let's read verse 25. We don't have time to go into the history of this, but it's an important component of history, the details about Karaite reckoning. In verse 25 it says, he, talking of the little horn or the papacy, shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until the times and the dividing of time. So we have an understanding of what these changes that the papacy made, but one of the things that we don't have understanding on generally as God's people, when it talks about changing of times, one of the fixed objectives as soon as the papacy came to power in 538 was to destroy the Hebrew calendar. And the Hebrew calendar up to that time was based upon Karaite reckoning largely. In the time of Christ, they were very, very rigid and very strict. The Karaite reckoning, we call it Karaite reckoning, but the Karaites weren't in existence in the time of Christ. This was biblical reckoning. This is how the Jews were instructed to keep their years. From Leviticus 23, they had to use the sun and the moon and the barley harvest. But as soon as the papacy comes into power, one of its first objectives is to destroy all traces of Jewish reckoning. And the reason for that is obvious, because at the end of the world, Satan knows that for God's people to understand their own history in the final generation, we need to understand about Karaite reckoning. We need to understand about the times that God has instructed his people to follow, because all prophecy is going to be fulfilled on these literal dates, as I would explain in the Millerite history. I'm not talking about being fulfilled in literal dates in our own history, but we're using all those dates symbolically at the end of the world. But for the Millerites to understand their own history and to be fulfilled to the very letter with respect to the feast days, they have to have a clear understanding of Karaite reckoning. Satan knows this centuries before, and one of the things that he does straight away is he begins to destroy the Hebrew calendar. And it got to a stage where you would be imprisoned and even threatened with death if you try to calculate when the beginning of the new year would be according to biblical reckoning. So just imagine that. If you want to start your own year at a particular time, the state is going to come in through the influence of the church and put you into prison for that. It gets that serious about an understanding of Karaite reckoning. So this is a fundamental truth that we need to understand. So, just to summarize, what have we looked at so far? I've tried to show you the importance of Ezra chapter 7 and how the development of Ezra 7 has brought to view the first day of the first month, the first day of the fifth month, and we're going to see those things as they should be used symbolically, because we can go into the scripture and find out an event that occurs on the first day of the fifth month and see how that impacts our own history and how we would apply that. And then it's also open to us two different keys, the key of the 120 and the key of the 70. So we have 4 keys that Ezra 7 has opened up to us. And then it's opened up to us the binding off period. Because when you go to Millerite history and you see where the dates that these events occurred on, then you can see that the 5th day of the 4th month, which was a fulfillment of Ezra chapter 1, verse 1, gives you the beginning of the binding off period to the closing of the binding off period. So Ezra 7 has given us a lot of truth, and it's all happened very rapidly in the last 12 to 18 months. Then we've started to look at the various calendations and how we are required to use those. The reason we want to understand this is so that we can be grounded firmly that, yes, indeed, that the first day of the first month was April the 19th in the year 1844. And yes, the 5th day of the 4th month was July 21st, 1844, and the first day of the 5th month was August the 15th, 1844, and that the 10th day of the 7th month was October 22nd, 1844. So we want to prove that this is correct. And if you want to prove that this is correct, you need to have a basic working knowledge of Karaite reckoning and how that works. You could just go on an internet website and plug in the year 1844 and it would punch out all of these dates for you. You could do that. But over and over again, it's been my experience that when people do a superficial work on understanding this foundational material, when it gets to more difficult passages, more problematic issues, they begin to get shaken. Also, there are many people who are always introducing extraneous information into this message. And if you're not well grounded in these 4 dates and the methodology behind them, it's very easy to be swept away. We had an issue about this in a previous camp meeting prior to this one, that there were brethren who were trying to apply time at the end of the world, and they were basing it upon an incorrect application in 1844, how time was to be applied. And they were mixing up biblical reckoning and Karaite reckoning and adjusting it. And at first sight, it seems pretty straightforward because some of those things seem to fit in and seem to work. But we demonstrated that to get all of these 4 dates to work, you can only use Karaite reckoning to do that. And you need to have an understanding of Karaite reckoning. So if this all seems a bit technical and a bit above your heads, please remember my initial comments that when Moses, at the formalization of the message, speaks with God, God says, take your shoes off because this is holy ground. And this is the life and death message. And if the papacy took the pain and effort to imprison people, if they brought this truth back to view, back to light, when they were in power, you must realize that it has significance. And if you think that you're going to just get away with a superficial understanding of this and say, yes, I know it's the 19th of April and everything's okay, somewhere down the line, you're going to be tested on this and you'll end up crumbling, because there are many, many sophisticated arguments that people offer here which you can get caught out in the intricacies of it. I'll give you one example just in closing. We're going to discuss this in our next presentation. If this is a representation of a new moon or a dark moon, the moon that you can't see, this is called a new moon. Another way to describe it is to call it the conjunction. The Jews never began their months with that new moon. They began it with the first visible waxing crescent. So as soon as you could see a small sliver of silver, this would be the first day of the first month. And this would be the new moon. Now, I've seen a number of people in this year here. This was the 17th of April, and this was the 19th. And they use this event here and try and adjust the calendar for that year and try and develop new truths here. Because what they want to do is they want to take this truth, bring it into our own history, and try and calculate time in our history using this new moon. And so there are many, many little traps and snares for us if we're not well grounded in this truth. Just little things like this will throw you. And you know, we're in a group here where it's safe. Everybody's on the same side, and you know, if there's an issue, you can just turn to your brethren and say, you know, can you explain this? But we're all going to be tested individually, we're told. And if you're out somewhere, whether it's in a court or speaking at another church, and somebody throws this issue up and you're not familiar with it, you'll be left confounded. And there are people always listening. And if you don't have a reason for your faith and able to answer in an intelligent fashion, people look at this as a sign of maybe your message isn't true. So we really need to stretch our minds on so many levels, even on mathematics, even on some things about basic astronomy. Sorry? It is the 17th on that year, and this is part of the complication. It's this is 1844, the year 1844, the 19th of April, and the new moon was on the 17th that year. In that particular year, other months, other years, it can be different. It's a minefield, but it's very simple. There's simplicity to this. If you just follow the Bible rule, if you just follow what the Bible teaches us, and you have an understanding of it, it isn't that complicated. But there are many things that people introduce. I'm sure there are many things that I haven't thought about that people have got ideas and thoughts on out there, and each of us will be challenged by these things. Each of us will be challenged. Here? Yeah, first day of the first month. So this is how the Jews calculated their months. On the first day of the first month would be the first visible sliver of silver, and it wouldn't be this. This is not an accurate idea, and I'll explain that in my next presentation. Let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your loving kindness and your goodness towards us. Father, I pray that you could be with each of us here and inspire us to open up your word. We need to compare the Bible with historical events, with an understanding of the Jewish economy, with an understanding of how you required your people to keep their feast days, with a very clear understanding of Millerite history, and bring all these thoughts and ideas together, Father, so we can stand upon a firm platform and understand these things very clearly. Father, we are so used to, as a people, to understand things superficially, to be spoon-fed thoughts and ideas and historical dates without having a clear understanding of their relevance. Father, you have called your people to be wise, to be teachers. Help us to fulfill that role. We understand that we all do not have the same capacity. You have given talents to your people according to your good will. But even those of us who are not minded to understand these issues in a complicated way, we're still required to understand them. For those people, Lord, who are struggling here, who don't understand the relevancy of these things, may they see in your word how Satan views things very differently, how he sees great importance in obscuring these truths from your people, so that they would not have a clear understanding of the movements of Christ, both in the Millerite history and in our own. Father, may each of us, according to our ability, according to our talents, engage in this work of study and investigation, so that we might be able to give a true and firm answer for the reason of our faith. Is our prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.